All right, let's talk about a concept that is absolutely crucial for any law exam. And honestly, for understanding how the legal system works, we're talking about causation. It's all about that essential link, that connection between what someone does and what happens as a result.
So, let's just jump right in with a classic law school brain teaser. I mean, this seems impossible, right? A clearly did something very wrong. He shot B. But then lightning? That is a total freak accident. And believe it or not, courts have to deal with these kinds of bizarre intervening events all the time. Things like car crashes, medical mistakes, you name it. They have to figure out where responsibility really begins and where it ends.
The tool we use to solve this puzzle is called the chain of causation. See, the prosecutor's job isn't just to prove the defendant did something bad. No, they have to build a strong, unbroken chain, link by link, that connects that initial act all the way to the final harm. And if just one of those links is weak, or if it breaks, the whole case for that specific result, it can just fall apart.
Now, this chain of ours, it has two absolutely essential links, and you have to prove both of them for the chain to be complete. First, you've got actual cause. Think of this as the pure facts, the physics of what happened. And second, you have proximate cause, which is less about facts and more about a legal question. Is it fair to hold them responsible? So let's build this thing piece by piece.
All right, let's get to our first link, actual cause. You might also hear this called cause in fact, and honestly, it's the more straightforward part of the whole analysis. We're asking a simple, factual question. Did the defendant's action actually lead to the outcome?
So the main tool we use here is the but-for test. It's as simple as it sounds. You just ask, but for what the defendant did, would the harm have happened right then in that exact way? If the answer is no, then congratulations, you established actual cause. So in our lightning puzzle, but for A shooting B, B would not have been in that ambulance at that moment to get struck by lightning. Simple. First link forged.
Now, the but-for test is great, but it can run into some problems. Imagine two people start fires at opposite ends of a barn, and both fires burn it down. If you use the but-for test, you could argue that neither of them is the cause because the barn would have burned down anyway from the other fire. That's just a crazy result, right? So for situations like that, courts use the substantial factor test. They just ask, was each person's action a substantial factor in causing the harm?
So, we've got our first link, actual cause. But we are not done, not even close. Now we need the second and much, much trickier link, proximate cause. This is where we step away from pure physics and step into the world of legal policy. The question is no longer just what happened. Now it's, is it fair to hold this person legally responsible for what happened?
And really, this whole complicated idea, it boils down to one powerful concept, foreseeability. This is all about what a reasonable person would expect to happen. You know, if you punch someone, is it foreseeable they might fall and hit their head? Yeah, probably. But is it foreseeable that a piece of a satellite is going to fall out of orbit and hit them at that exact moment? No way. Absolutely not.
So here's the bottom line. If the result was a foreseeable consequence of what the defendant did, the chain of causation holds strong. But if it was something totally abnormal and unforeseeable, like, say, a bolt of lightning hitting an ambulance, then the chain is probably going to break. This is the legal system's way of drawing a line in the sand and saying, okay, your responsibility ends here.
But what happens when some new event comes along? Something that happens between the defendant's act and the final harm? Well, that's called an intervening cause, and it puts our proximate cause link to the ultimate test. Does this new event snap the chain of responsibility? Or is the chain strong enough to hold?
This right here explains the critical difference perfectly. If that new event was foreseeable, it just becomes another part of the story. The chain holds, and the defendant is still on the hook. But if the event is unforeseeable, totally bizarre, or truly independent, then it becomes what we call a superseding cause. And a superseding cause doesn't just weaken the chain, it shatters it. It completely relieves the original defendant of liability for that final result.
Okay, let's lock this in. A fender bender on the way to the hospital? You know, that's a foreseeable risk of being in an ambulance, so the chain holds. But an unrelated burglar breaking in and killing the victim? That is absolutely not a foreseeable result of the initial injury, so that chain breaks. You can even think about it with medical malpractice. If you hurt someone, some amount of negligent medical care is often considered foreseeable. But if a doctor intentionally poisons the victim at the hospital, that is so far outside the norm it becomes an independent, unforeseeable act, a superseding cause.
All right, theory is great, but let's apply this whole framework to a real and really tragic case to see how all these pieces fit together in a courtroom. We're talking about the infamous case of Stevenson versus State.
The facts here are disturbing, but the legal question is incredibly precise. Stevenson was clearly the actual cause of her injuries. That's the but-for test. But was he the proximate cause of her death, even though she was the one who physically took the poison? Or did her own action break that chain of his responsibility?
The court's answer was a firm no. The chain was not broken. They didn't see her act as a free, independent choice. They saw it as a direct and tragically foreseeable result of the horror he put her through. And you know, this principle from 1932 is still incredibly relevant today in cases involving things like long-term bullying or domestic abuse that sadly lead to a victim taking their own life. Courts still have to ask if that final act was a foreseeable result of the defendant's torment.
So to pull this all together, this flowchart right here, this is your roadmap. It's the entire analysis on a single page. You start with the defendant's act, you check for actual cause, and then you move into that crucial analysis of proximate cause, looking really carefully at any intervening events and asking, was this foreseeable? It is the perfect guide. So what's the big takeaway from all this? Simple. Causation is a structured two-part test. Never ever skip a step. But you should know that on any exam, the real points, the deep analysis, happens in step 2. It's all about digging into proximate cause and foreseeability. Mastering this isn't just about passing a test, it's about understanding how our legal system decides who to hold accountable.
So we'll leave you with a final thought. The law uses this idea of foreseeability to try and put a reasonable limit on our legal responsibility. But as our world gets more and more complex, with things like online harassment leading to self-harm or selling drugs that lead to a fatal overdose, the question of what is truly foreseeable becomes one of the hardest and most important questions a court ever has to answer.